this fall is the Old Testament as the template for the Christian's inner spiritual life. And to put it very concisely, as you know, the Bible starts in Eden, it ends in Revelation. You could say that Revelation, or you could say, I do say, that Revelation is the Garden of Eden finished. That's the difference between Eden and Revelation. So that the history of Israel, which begins, with Abraham, but even Abraham came from someplace. He comes from Noah, but even Noah comes from someplace. And Noah comes from Seth, who comes from someplace, who comes from Adam and Eve, outside the garden. Adam and Eve don't come from within the garden. So that the history of Israel originates ultimately in the mystery of the Garden of Eden. And the history of Israel looks like the replay of the Garden of Eden. The world comes into being. Adam and Eve are created from the dust of the ground. Israel is created Israel is virtually in chaos, in nothingness, in the dark, the formlessness of their slavery in Egypt. They are created as a people through the Exodus, the deliverance to the Red Sea. That's what creates them and establishes them as the people whose God is Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of Adam and Eve. Then they come out of the Red Sea, and they are led through the wilderness into the Promised Land, just like Adam and Eve are raised from the ground. Adam is raised from the ground. Eve isn't formed yet. Adam is raised from the ground, and he is placed in the garden. So you see how the placing of Adam in the Garden of Eden corresponds to the Exodus, where God is placing Israel in the Promised Land. So you see how the Promised Land corresponds to Eden. Then Adam and Eve, I think it's significant that Eve is formed in the garden. She's not formed outside the garden. She's formed in the garden. She's formed from Adam's rib inside the garden. And Adam is put into a sleep, or even in an ecstasis. He's made to stand outside of himself, or to be outside of himself, in this kind of ecstatic sleep. And in that ecstatic sleep, Eve is fashioned from his rib in the garden. Now, this is all the more intriguing because in the New Testament, this word ecstasis, literally standing outside of oneself, in other words, being in an unordinary place. You're not in the ordinary anymore. You're somewhere in the deep, in the beyond. Ecstasis is the word that's described, or that is used to describe the myrrh-bearing women, for example, coming to the tomb of Christ when he's on the third day, when he's about to be resurrected, when he is resurrected, and coming to the tomb to discover his resurrection as it's announced to them by the angel. So that the ecstasis that Adam is placed in, the ecstatic sleep that he's placed into while God is building Eve from his rib, is clearly a paschal mystery, which I think is all the more remarkable in that the writer of Genesis, Moses presumably, he doesn't particularly know the details of Pascha, and yet here he is already talking about Pascha. So then the building of Eve from the rib of Adam in the garden, while Adam is asleep, would correspond to the blood and water coming out of the rib of Christ while he is asleep on the cross. In other words, Eve is an image of the church being built from the rib of Christ, the new Adam, being built from his substance, his human substance, his blood and his water, being fashioned into the church. The blood and water signifying the sacraments, Holy Eucharist and Holy Baptism. Even as Christ was himself formed from the substance of Eve, from the Theotokos, like Adam is formed from the substance of the earth. So you have all of these parallels. So then Adam and Eve, they're given a command. Israel is given a command on their way to the exit, to the promised land, given to them on Mount Sinai. And Adam and Eve disobey the command. Israel, again and again, disobeys the command, even to the point of bringing idols into the temple of Solomon, into the temple, and even into the sanctuary of the temple. So Adam and Eve were warned by God that you don't disobey. If you do, you will surely die. Israel is warned, don't disobey the commandments of God. If you do, you will surely die. You will surely be destroyed, and that's exactly what happens. Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, and Israel is expelled from the promised land. First the northern kingdom, taken by the Assyrians, what is it, the 8th century BC or so, and then the southern kingdom, taken by the Babylonians in the 6th century or so. So that the nation of Israel is destroyed, and yet God's promise remains. It is not destroyed with the disobedience of Israel, nor is it destroyed with the disobedience of Adam and Eve. So when we are baptized, so I said, that God fashions Eve from the rib of Adam, corresponding to the blood and water pouring forth from Adam's side, being fashioned into the church. And so we in our baptism, we enter into and become one with, we become members of this body of Christ. And we have to understand, the church as the body of Christ is not some, vaporous gas floating up there. And you just kind of sniff it, you think about it, or you agree with what, you agree with it, and you're in the church. Understand, the church is the body of Christ, and the body of Christ is the incarnation of God. The church is concrete. She's not some amorphous gas. She's not a teaching, that is floating around up there, and that is somewhat inaccessible, somewhat unknowable, so that we here on earth, we just do our best to discern what that truth is. And so you see it one way, you see it another way, I see it another way, but that's okay. We differ, we have differences of opinion, but let's just call it different perspectives on this one teaching up there, or this mess or whatever, this amorphous gas up there. We'll just say that there are different perspectives, and we'll join hands and we'll be good buddies. We'll be nice to one another. We'll form ecumenical dialogues. We'll have consensus statements. But what's important is that we're nice to one another and that nobody says that the other person is wrong. That's not the church. That's not the church. The church is the body of Christ. And the body of Christ was concrete. You could poke it, he even when he's resurrected, he comes to the disciples and he says, come on, here's my hands. Look at the nail prints in my hands. Put your fingers into my nail prints. Put your hands into my side. Poke me. You can touch me. You can see. You can feel me. I eat. I drink. Come on now. So when we are baptized into the church, we come into this body of Christ that has substance. It's concrete. It's firm. It's physical. It's material. And how is the church the incarnation, the body of Christ? I offer that the church, that the doctrines of the church could be the mind of Christ. The prayers of the church could be the soul of Christ. And the sacraments of the church, the liturgical structure of her worship, this would be the body of Christ. So when we come into the church, we're coming into the mystery of the incarnation of Christ. So, and it is so concrete, so firm, that you don't come into the church by just professing belief. That's only the beginning. You come into the church, you have to be dunked in real water. You're anointed with real oil. And then you eat and drink real bread and real wine. It's not just the memorial, it's the mystery of Christ's body. And now your body has partaken of Christ's body, and now Christ's body, his resurrected body, through the bread and the wine, is now mingling with your body. And Christ is becoming, if you will, he's trying to become incarnate in you. Right? So that's something of an aside to all of this. It's an important aside. But nonetheless, the point that I'm driving at is that having come into the church through baptism and Holy Eucharist, and having become joined to the body of Christ, through the sacraments of the church, we are joined to the whole history of Israel because of Christ's descent in the flesh, which we'll go through in just a minute, to emphasize how and why, when one becomes a member of the church, Christ's body, one is becoming, one is entering into, and one is becoming a part of Israel. So that now Israel's history is my history. My history is Israel's history. And so now the play, if you will, the movement, the dynamic of Israel's history becomes my history. Through my baptism, I have been led through the Red Sea. I have even partaken of the tree of life through the body and blood of Christ in the Holy Eucharist. So that somehow the tree of life, which is in the Garden of Eden, has been planted in me. That's something of a mystery, because I'm not myself quite yet in the Garden of Eden. I have to make my way to the promised land. So that when I'm raised up from the baptismal font, I am, as it were, placed in the garden, and yet I still have to come to the garden. I'm placed in the garden in that what seems to me I now am taken back to that place where Adam and Eve fell. And now I have to play that out again in my own life. A commandment, remember, is given to Adam and Eve. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A commandment is given to me. Deny yourself. Take up your cross. Follow me. Lose your life for my sake in the Gospels. Put to death what's earthly in you. Your ego, your self-love, your idolatry. That's the commandment that's been given to me.